First of all, did you guys hear the Goldman Sachs news?
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Well, we didn't quite get him yet, but civil charges brought against Goldman Sachs for fraud. And I can't tell you how much of the perfect guest we have in the studio right now to discuss this. Simon Johnson, former chief economist for the International Monetary Fund, professor at MIT Sloan School of Management, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, a member of the CBO's panel of economic advisors, co-founder of the Baseline Scenario, and author of The 13 Bankers, The Wall Street Takeover and the Next Financial Meltdown. That's pretty good credentials. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice
really appreciate it. You know, anybody who watches the show knows that I'm a big fan of yours, and I quote you all the time. Now, I want to talk about the root causes of the meltdown and the next financial meltdown, but let's start with today's dramatic news, Goldman Sachs. So what exactly did the SEC do here? What did they charge them with? Let's start talking about that first.
They charged them with fraud. They charged them with misleading their customers. They charged them with basically setting up, deliberately designing at the behest of an investor, actually a very famous investor, John Paulson, designing a vehicle that John Paulson could go out and short, sell, right, hoping that it would go down. And then they sold this vehicle to unsuspecting investors, clients, customers of Goldman without telling them what they knew about Paulson's intentions and who had designed this instrument.
So the people that were the investors that Goldman Sachs said, hey, everything's going to be all right, they lost $1 billion on this alone. Okay, it looks like John Paulson made about $3.7 billion on all of his shorts in regards to this, but it looks like this was about $1 billion that got transferred to Paulson. So John Paulson's motivations are clear, right? That's obvious. What's Goldman's motivation here?
They must have made money. They had a fee, for sure. There may have been, maybe they had some other participation. We don't know at this point. But basically, Paulson paid them to set up their clients to get ripped off. It's a transfer. It's a straight transfer from their customers, presumably most of whom liked Goldman and trusted them going into this, to Mr. Paulson.
So, and I saw in the records that Paulson paid him $15 million for this. Now, $15 million seems like a lot of money, but, you know, for Goldman, I would have thought that they would have figured out on how to get in on the scam a little better than that, honestly. Because, okay, so they're getting money from their investors, then they get the $15 million from Paulson. So who are the investors? Let me ask you that, because that's the real problem. I mean, they're the ones that got taken for a ride. Who are they?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the details at that level. I think it's people who were working with Goldman on other bases, investment funds of various kinds, the usual kinds of pension clients, fixed income.
Exactly. See, that's the thing that gets me, Simon. It's. Can I call you Simon?
Sure.
Seems a little forward, but nonetheless. It's the pension funds. They're the ultimate, and there's other factors and other investors, foreign banks, etc. But whenever I read these stories, it seems like they're the last sucker at the table. You know, that the investing guys think, all right, look, the pension guys, they don't know. And it's just, grandma and grandpa out there, and we'll just take their money nice and easy. What can the pension funds do about it?
Well, you can have a class action suit on the back of this. It'd be kind of surprising, actually, if the people who lost money this way didn't follow up on the SEC complaint with their own action. We haven't seen that yet, but that's what I would expect.
They'd sue Goldman and they'd sue John Paulson, you think?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to take a position on this. It's not clear that what Paulson did was wrong or illegal, or that you can get him on it. It might not feel good to you and me, and it might be a pretty objectionable practice that we should outlaw going forward. But what Goldman is accused of doing, and it seems pretty plausible, right, is that they deliberately misled people by withholding material information. That's fraud. What did Paulson do that was withholding material information? I don't think he was telling the clients of Goldman to buy this stuff. Goldman was telling them that.
Right. So finally on this front, how is this related to the bets that Goldman Sachs made with AIG that we, the taxpayer, wound up paying off at $12.9 billion? Because it seems like they took a similar short position with AIG. Are they related, or are they the same thing but not related to this case?
No, I don't think there's an issue of material non-disclosure in the AIG circumstance. There may be something else. I think actually Goldman's arrangements with Greece are somewhat parallel to what we're looking at in this vehicle with Paulson, because remember Goldman helped Greece hide some debt, and then went out and sold new Greek debt not representing accurately what they knew about the true indebtedness. But I have to say that the Paulson deal looks a lot worse and feels a lot worse to everybody in the market than even the most negative interpretation of what Goldman did in Greece.
Well, but isn't it material representation when then Goldman's putting together all those CDOs, et cetera, selling it to people, and then turning around and making their own bets against that stuff with AIG?
Well, as you know, this has been contentious for a while, and there's an issue of what is standard market practice with regard to hedging. Right. And honestly, I think going forward, we're going to have to address all of this. I mean, this is the case, exactly the case for re-regulating finance properly, and for particularly preventing the big banks from getting too big and too powerful, so they can get away with stuff like that. But I'm not, and I actually prior to this morning, I even gave a talk last night in Los Angeles. One of the questions was, why haven't we seen legal action against Goldman? And I must say, I said at that point, I think these guys are very smart and they've designed it so they can get away with it. I'm glad I was wrong on that. I hope the SEC prevails, but that is where we are.
That's interesting, because last night I was explaining to a friend the Goldman Sachs AIG, what I call the scam, and I explained to him, and then we wake up and look at the paper, and that's exactly what they got charged on this Paulson deal, and he's like, man, that was exactly what you described last night. So it's interesting. So now let's get to the bigger costs, okay, because that's what I'm excited about here. So, as I look at the reasons why we had the initial 2008 meltdown, there are many, many reasons. The making loans and then passing them off on to other people, so you don't have an incentive to make a sound loan, and leverage, derivatives, etc. And there's at least 20 causes we can go down the list. But to me, and I need you to correct me where I'm wrong here, okay? Because I'm trying to understand it better. To me, it seems that the number one issue is leverage, because if you screw up a bet and you're not leveraged that much, well, okay, it happens and you can recover from that. But if you're leveraged 30 to 1 and you have a little bit of a variation in price, let alone a big one, then, well, obviously you can't recover. So isn't leverage the largest issue?
Well, leverage is obviously key, right? And debt-financed bubbles are a big part of what keeps getting us into trouble. So you can compare that with the dot-com bubble, which wasn't particularly debt-financed. It was very traumatic when it burst, but go back and look and see if you can find that recession in the data. You can't actually. There aren't two negative consecutive quarters. Okay, so clearly there's something about the way we run our financial system around leverage that hit us really hard in September 2008. It was a big issue in emerging markets, 97, 98. It was actually what brought down Citigroup in 89 to 91 and also in 82. And I think that's what lies in our future also.
So let's talk about that, because we have this leverage situation that's significantly worse, and I'm glad you brought the dot-com bubble up, because you're right, you don't have that kind of cratering and widespread effect after that bubble burst, because bubbles do happen, right?
Right.
Now, one of the things that changed was in 2004, the SEC had that meeting where they said, oh, by the way, you can just take any leverage you like, and we're going to leave it to your best discretion. I see that as an absolutely pivotal moment. And now that hasn't gotten fixed. I know that. Is anyone even proposing to fix it in the House, the Senate, or the Obama version of financial reform?
There are some efforts in amendments that I think will be introduced onto the Senate floor to put a cap on leverage. I don't know how those will do. I mean, the financial reform legislation, while a step in the right direction, is a fairly small step. The Goldman case, which announced today, actually I think may solidify support behind the people I work with and support who are pushing for a strengthening of the Dodd bill in the Senate. But let's see. I still think the odds are against substantial progress on this legislative cycle.
I think I saw a quote from Tim Geithner saying it's not wise to put leverage limits. Now, I don't see how that position is defensible, and I don't see how people can vote against that amendment, except for the fact that, as you write about in 13 bankers, et cetera, they're kind of bought off, so that they will vote against that amendment likely. But is there a logical argument to say no, banks should be able to leverage as high as they like?
Oh, no, there isn't. And actually, I think Secretary Geithner's position would be you shouldn't legislate leverage limits, and just like he thinks you shouldn't legislate capital requirements, you should leave that to the regulator, right? The problem is you have a huge, actually catch-22, which is that our regulators today in the U.S. Will say, well, what was the legislative intent here? The legislation could have been to put a very tough limit on leverage, but they didn't do it. They left it to us, and clearly they don't intend there to be a tight limit on leverage because they didn't do it. right? So if you delegate to the regulators, you're not going to get sensible re-regulation out of this.
Has there been any regulation so far, and what would be the mechanism? So when he says, "Oh, let's leave it to the regulators," right now, is there a cap on leverage? Has any regulator said, "Hey, you know what, Citigroup, as an example, you can't go to 15-to-1 leverage"? I don't know. That might exist. Has that happened?
There certainly have been limits, and regulators do look at the books of these banks, and there are capital requirements, right? And capital requirements are related to leverage. But right now, these limits are not very binding, and certainly during the key thing is, what do you do in the boom? In the boom, do you really restrict what banks do, or do you let them do all this off-balance sheet stuff, which is what Citi and others did, as a way to get around capital requirements, and in the same thing you can do for leverage caps.
So even if they're being controlled now by regulators, they're going to be much harder to control if things start to go really well, because that's when people get excited and the bubble grows, and then they take more risk, and then we have another collapse.
And they tell you they've invented some new financial products that, in fact, I attended a presentation today by phone where we were told about some new product that takes the risk out of investing.
All right, now, I'm sure, of course. And the minute you hear that, that's when you know the next financial meltdown's coming. Because I have friends who work on Wall Street, and the minute they tell me, "Oh, something can't go wrong," I think, okay, it's only a matter of time. Okay, now it's within a month or two, this thing's going to blow up. So one more point on leverage, but as it relates to everything else, do you think that obviously you think it should go into the law, right? But should there be a hard cap, and what should it be? Should it be 10-to-1, 12-to-1? What would we base that on?
Well, I think there should be a hard cap on the size of banks. That's the main thing we're pushing for. I don't think any bank should be allowed to have assets more than 4% of GDP. And then you should apply a risk adjustment to that, so actually you'd push them down to be lower. So our biggest banks would be, instead of $2 trillion or $2.5 trillion, you'd push them down to say $300 to $400 billion as a headline number. And if you're a risky bank, you want to go out and do a Goldman Sachs type business, assuming Goldman stays with us, that you'd be smaller. Still, you'd be down around $100 billion. See, there's no evidence for economies of scale, scope, or other benefits to society of banks bigger than $100 billion in total assets. And we've got these $2 trillion monsters running around, threatening to blow themselves up. And when they blow themselves up, they say, if you do anything to us, that's what the 13 bankers basically said, if you touch us, or our management structure, or our board of directors, or our bonuses, or our pensions, or anything, you'll cause an even deeper financial crisis. And if it sounds like extortion, it is extortion.
Well, it's absurd that Geithner and the rest of them went for it. But I want to talk about that in a little bit. So if you think you got the size of the so-called risky banks down to $100 billion, then you don't mind how much they leverage, and that's just their business, and if they want to go under, they go under?
No, that's a fair question. I think I care much less. I think that I'm not opposed to a leverage cap if you think we can get one, but I think the key thing is make them small enough to fail.
See, what I'm worried is that even if you split them all up into $100 billion entities, that if they're all still going to be intertwined, and that they're still going to go all down at the same time, and we're still going to have that same problem as long as we're letting them take that big risk. That's why I think, that there's, as you write about in the book, we had a 50-year stretch where we didn't have busts. It didn't go up and down, and part of it was that we had capped leverage. But as part of that conversation, let's move on to derivatives, because I've always thought, how Bill Clinton said it's the economy stupid when he ran. I always thought one of the main focuses here is the derivative stupid. And here's what no one can explain to me. How can we have a $60 trillion worldwide GDP and have a $605 trillion derivatives market, and people tell me, oh no, it's going to be okay? It can't possibly be okay. That obviously means we're way overbetting than what exists, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, certainly yes is the answer. Remember that the total numbers are a little bit less than that. I think we argue that you shouldn't use the total notional value. You should use the actual amount of money that people have at stake, and amount of money people can lose, or the market value, if you prefer, the market value of these transactions if they were sold tomorrow. Of course, we don't actually know what that market value is. These derivatives should all be put onto exchanges. The exchanges should be regulated. There should be much higher capital requirements for all derivatives positions, and that would cause the derivatives market to shrink vastly. So I agree with you absolutely on what you're pushing for here.
Well, let's understand the derivatives a little bit better because, people get lost when you say derivatives. My main problem are, what I believe are called naked credit default swaps, where, and they might go by other names as well, but basically side bets, right? Where, you have a house and I gave you the loan, and JR and Jesus make a bet on whether you're going to pay back that loan or not. I don't see the value in that bet at all. If I do a derivative between you and I got corn, I'm selling oil, we get the value of the original derivative. But is there any reason why those side bets should even be allowed?
Well, look, I don't mind if you want to go to Vegas and bet on crazy things, right? That doesn't bother me at all.
Right.
And if you want to lose all your money in Vegas, then we just have to worry. There are some serious issues around addiction to gambling, and we should look at it on that basis. But that's a different matter. What worries me, Cenk, is system risk, right? So if you're doing a CDS bet and you lose some money or you make some money, fine. But if the structure of naked credit default swaps is such that you can damage the system, right, by being successful betting heavily, or you can create a lot of counterparty risk because you fail, other people fail, and that spreads through to impact, for example, the banks that run the payment system. Then I'm much more worried. And I would be erring, if I were a regulator, I would be erring massively on the side of being really cautious with anything that's not transparent.
Right. And I think transparency is a great thing. I love that Obama's pushing hard on it this week, much harder than we've seen him push on it before. I don't think it does enough because I think that if they start making those side bets, it's going to be nearly impossible to unravel them. Because as we see, they make it with one another to the point where they all go down at the same time. And it doesn't take much because of the leverage issue for the bet to go south 3% if you're leveraged 30-1, and then you dragged everybody down with you. So I want to get a sense before we go off that topic of how big is it? So how much of the problem was, for example, the subprime, actual loans, toxic assets, et cetera, and how, and relative to that, how big were the bets made on top of it? So was it the subprime problem in the first place, or was it the gargantuan bets made on top of those?
That's an interesting question. It was the subprime that went bad. Obviously, it was the assumption that people had for various self-serving reasons that house prices would go up forever, and that led to a lot of mistaken thinking. But I remember going to a meeting with a senior Federal Reserve official in early 2007 when he asked to discuss the housing problems. He was actually, in retrospect, quite accurate on the bad loans and the current picture, but it completely at odds with reality, as it turned out, in terms of the impact on the financial system. So that goes to your gargantuan bets point, right? So we had this subprime, it went bad, there would have been a recession, okay, you have it. But on top of that, we built these very complex structures, and the big banks had an incentive to make this complex, honestly, in ways I don't think even they understood what they were doing. I don't think these banks are well managed. I mean, I know they pay themselves a lot of money. I know we think money is the same thing as status and cleverness in this country, but honestly, it's not always. And these guys didn't know what they were doing. They messed up massively, and we haven't fixed it. We haven't changed the incentives that they have to do the same sort of thing again. They won't do it exactly the same way, but they'll do something like this.
So do we even know, I know that we don't have the transparency now, do we know what the relationship is between the underlying assets and the bets made on top of those assets? Do we know if the bets are 10 times as large, twice as large, or half the size of the underlying assets? See what I mean by that question?
Yeah, so the honest, blunt answer is no, we don't know. If you look at the total amount of losses, the IMF did this calculation. They did it when I was there, a different department from mine, but I always thought these guys did great work, and they kept it up. I mean, the amount of losses for the financial system, right? So this is not total loss because it doesn't include money that investors lost or money that individuals lost, but the money that was lost in the sort of the core of our financial system in the United States, peaked. The estimates peaked around $2 trillion. Now, how much of that was, the basic loss of value on those houses versus the multiplier from, it's probably something in the order of 4 or 5 to 1. But of course, the key thing is not just that magnification, it's also the uncertainty, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, what happened in September, October 2008 was a global financial panic. Banks wouldn't lend to each other because they didn't know what their books were. And actually, to be honest, I was talking to some fixed income people just this morning, actually, talking about very specific situations, scenarios impacting major banks in the US. They still, amazingly enough, don't have a very detailed, granular handle on their own risk with regard to certain obvious things that are coming down the pike.
I remember this amazing quote by Bob Rubin when Newsweek interviewed him, and they asked him about credit default swaps, and he said, I don't even know what those are. He said, I haven't been in the game really on the ground level for like 15 years. I don't. So you made $126 million on the board of Citigroup while these credit default swaps were bankrupting the company, and you don't know what they are? I mean, that's either incredibly disingenuous or more frightening.
I'm in the more frightening camp. Look, the problem, Cenk, is that boards of directors, this governance structure that we've had for a long time in this country, just doesn't work for something complex, fast-moving, like a financial firm that uses a lot of derivative positions. So the guys on the board of directors think they can trust the CEO. The CEO thinks he can trust, you know, whoever his or her key lieutenants are, and who knows who they're trusting. And the guys down the bottom have an incentive. The system gives them an incentive to take a lot of risk. That's how they get compensated if it works out. And if it doesn't work out, it's someone else's problem. They can leave and go set up a hedge fund.
See, that's exactly where I want to pick up the conversation. We got to take a little bit of a break here, but I want to talk about the Cassano loophole, about those same incentives you were just mentioning, about those structural boards, and then most importantly, what's next? Do we have a financial meltdown coming? So we'll be right back on the Young Turks. Back on the Young Turks. Simon Johnson's still with us in the studio. He's a former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. His blog is The Baseline Scenario, which I read often, at the MIT Sloan School of Management, of course, and the author of 13 Bankers. So before we get to whether we have hope or don't have hope as to the next disaster, it seems to me another issue is what I call the Cassano loophole, which is the incentive of the executives are not the same as the incentive of the company itself. If AIG goes under, if Cassano has already walked away with $315 million, what does he care? You know, and now he might say, oh, no, I care a little bit, but he cares a hell of a lot more about the $300-some-odd million. Is there any reform that might address that? And if there isn't, aren't the executives incentivized to continue to take the kind of risk that's going to put us all in danger?
Yes, they have that incentive, and there is no reform on the table or in the pipeline that would really address the particular problem you're talking about. Honestly, we should be able to claw back the money that executives have earned in the run-up to a financial collapse, and then if that's violation of contract or some other problem, they can sue the government, and good luck with that.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree on clawbacks, and I think we have almost no chance of getting that passed. So now the final part of the puzzle in my mind is what you talk a lot about in 13 Bankers, which is regulatory capture, you know, and then political capture, intellectual capture, etc. So it's, and we know there's no reform to that, but what would be the reform? I mean, part of the problem is if a guy's at the SEC, as an example, right? Now the SEC did something great today. Okay, keep that in mind. But he knows that if he plays ball and he leaves, and he's going to get a job at Citigroup or J.P. Morgan, et cetera, well, then he's got a great incentive to play ball. If you're Bob Rubin and you know it's Treasury Secretary, you can deregulate and then make $126 million. You got a lot of incentive to play ball. How do you solve that problem? Well,
actually, let's think about the SEC. This is very interesting today, Cenk, because did the value of those SEC people, I mean, let's say the revolving door still exists going forward, I presume it does. Did their value go up or down in the private market because now they're the tough guys? Now they're the guys you fear, right? Mm-hmm. They're the guys who can be who will be hired by top Wall Street law firms to probably next time to work on the defense of corporate interests. But actually, it's in the interest of SEC lawyers, if you think of it in these terms, as long as they've got the right political backing, right? As long as the whole thing doesn't blow up in their faces, because the White House, you know, backs down or something, which I don't think they will. But as long as they push this through and as long as it succeeds, they're the new tough guys in town. The new sheriff, right? Who brings a little bit of order. He's the guy you want to bring in to run, you know, to run security in the bank when he stops being sheriff.
Well, maybe, but you remember what happened to the old sheriff of Wall Street?
There was a sheriff? When was the last sheriff?
Well, Elliot Spitzer used to be known as the sheriff of Wall Street, and that didn't work out so well for him. Look at that. Hey, his bank transactions wound up becoming headed over to the FBI. So I'm not sure. Like, there's 100 examples of people who didn't play ball and got punished for it, right? And there's 100 examples of guys who did and wound up with great jobs.
Look, this is power, Cenk. This is a confrontation. This is an enormous fight. You know, we're in it to win it, okay? And either the banks are going to stomp all over us and completely ruin this economy, which is possible, but that's a pretty dramatic bad outcome. And I can tell you a lot of people from business, and from the left and the right and the center. That's why we put all their blurbs in the book to show you that. A lot of people get this. A lot of people think the banks are out of control. Our book, our view is not anti-market, it's not anti-finance, it's against this distortion of power and distortion of the economy.
All right, let's get to are we going to crash again, and how can we avoid that? You're right. I saw Senator Jim Bunning loved the book. I'm amazed by that. Right, very conservative Republican from Kentucky. But at the same time, you see the Republicans today all united against financial reform. They're useless. I think hoping that the Republicans are going to figure out what's going on, or they do know what's going on, but that they won't take the money from the banks is a totally hopeless cause.
I actually think it's terrific. I think it's brilliant. If all 41 of them do line up to prevent financial reform, and you then take that to the elections in November, they're the guys who supported Too Big to Fail. They're the guys who brought you the crisis. Actually, by the way, and the Obama administration has been far too nice about this, who was in charge during the 8 years of the boom and the run-up to the crash? And now these guys won't fix it? And now these guys tell you that if you touch any of the structure, it'll be bad? It's not very credible. They'll be crushed.
Well, if the Democrats play it right, and that's a giant if, and that's part of the problem of Obama not making his case, which happens all the time, and he didn't make his case, in exactly what you're referring to, saying, hey, wait a minute, the guys who brought you this collapse was the Bush administration for the last 8 years. So, but let's talk about whether there's going to be another crash. So I'm worried, as we talked about in the last segment, we don't have leverage under control. We don't have derivatives under control. We still have the Cassano loophole, and our regulators, our politicians, are still largely bought by the bankers. To me, I want somebody to talk me down, but it seems that another crash, given these circumstances, even if we get the so-called tough Obama bill through, the Obama version of the bill through, that another crash is inevitable.
Isn't the most common definition of insanity doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes?
That's what people say. So we're doing it again. Can I say to the audience, I'm sorry, I don't want to tell you this, but we're going to crash again?
Absolutely, unless we fix it. That's the point of the book. That's why we wrote the book, Cenk, is to make this point. You either fix it, and it is fixable. From an economic point of view, it's not that hard, okay? From a political point of view, I fully grant you a bit of an uphill struggle, all right? But that's Washington.
I love your understatement. A bit of an uphill struggle.
Look, outside of Washington, I've been going around the country with the book, talking to people. I talked to 750 people total in Chicago this week. I talked to 150 people in LA just yesterday. People get this. They get this completely. I go on shows like this. I go on call-in shows. People understand this, Cenk, outside of Washington. In the bubble, I agree. The bubble is a little distorted, and there's a lot of money, and the ideology of finance and of free market finance is a little crazed. But people get this, and I think I know we will fix it. I hope we fix it before the next meltdown. Right?
See, but I don't see that as... of course, everything is possible, and of course, I want to be hopeful, and ultimately, what I always say is I'm long-term hopeful, right? But in the short term, it seems that when you look at it from a political perspective, if this reform gets passed, it's definitely not good enough, and they're not going to come back to it. I mean, it's not like, all right, great, we got financial reform passed, now let's try harder financial reform. Can you see that happening?
Depends what happens. Look, an event like this Goldman Sachs prosecution is a game changer. Okay? And what have we had in recent weeks? We've had this Goldman Sachs case. We've had the hearings held by Senator Levin really exposing fraudulent practices at Washington Mutual. And we've had the Lucas report on Lehman. This is a pattern of behavior. Remember, Ferdinand Pecora in the 1930s worked long and hard to demonstrate that what Wall Street had done in the 1920s was not kind of normal business practices gone a little bit astray. It was deeply wrong, fraudulent, and should have been all illegal, but actually they got away with a lot of stuff. Now, Pecora worked for a long time before he nailed in public enough executives. He got the guy who's head of National City, for example. He got J.P. Morgan Jr., the original J.P. Morgan's son. And he made them look bad, right? That was the turning point. That built the consensus that demanded real reform. The consensus is a fascinating animal, Cenk, okay? I've studied this for a long time. This is, in the IMF, you're trying to chip away at the official consensus. You're trying to move people in a certain direction. It just won't move. People are like, oh, no, we do it this way. We've always done this, so we're going to do it this way. And then something happens. And then it tips over, right? You see it because of a scandal or a case or something egregious, and you say, oh, my goodness. We must fix this.
But we already had that moment, and we totally flushed it down the toilet. So now what I'm afraid of is that we need a second moment like that, but that second moment is one we're not going to be able to recover from.
Actually, what we need is leadership. So in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt decided to take on J.P. Morgan, the original J.P. Morgan, right? Because the guy had built a railroad trust that was just massively egregious and ridiculous. And he said, you know, we're going to take Northern Securities to the Supreme Court, take it all the way through the court system, using the Sherman Antitrust Act, which no one had done before against an industrial trust. Nobody knew what Roosevelt was doing or why. I mean, a modern antitrust thinking and theory just didn't exist, okay, not in the mainstream. And nobody thought he would win. The Senate was called the Millionaires Club for a reason. So J.P. Morgan comes to the White House, right, February 1902, and he says, if we've done anything wrong, send your man to see my man and we'll fix it up. And Roosevelt and his Attorney General said, thank goodness, they said, no, we don't want to fix it up. We want to stop it. And they won in the Supreme Court 5-4, by the way. And out of that came antitrust cases, antitrust theory. And by 1912, the mainstream consensus in this country was overwhelmingly in favor of breaking up Standard Oil, which was by far the most powerful company in the United States at that time. And we broke into 35, 37 pieces. Most of them did well. The shareholders made money. And John D. Rockefeller was able to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the public through his great acts of charity.
Right, except what's changed since then is our politics changed because of other Supreme Court decisions allowing corporations to have First Amendment rights and spending campaigns. So that happens in 1978, a major case where they say, yes, corporations, 5-4 decision, have a right to have First Amendment rights and they can spend on the campaigns. And since then, we don't have any more Roosevelts. So, you know, you talk about Jefferson, you talk about Jackson, you talk about Roosevelt, both Roosevelts, and you see these great American heroes that push for democracy and the masses, etc. But the system has now changed that I don't believe it allows for that. I believe that it set up the incentives and disincentives so that guy can't make it through. The corporate media is different, the politics is different, and now our banking rules are out of control and different. So I don't see what changes it until, I mean, you acknowledge there's an iceberg ahead. I'm worried that we can't change until we hit the iceberg.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I'm not as negative. In 1902, the Republicans controlled the Senate. The Republicans had controlled the Senate since the Civil War. They were the bastions of business. Nelson Aldrich, arguably the most powerful Republican in the Senate, his daughter was married shortly thereafter to John D. Rockefeller's son. Okay, there was no direct election of senators, by the way. Right?
Right.
So, I mean, this was an oligarchy. It was taken on, and it was beaten in substantial part by Theodore Roosevelt. Now, they didn't do a perfect job, I'll grant you. The 20s brought their own version of the mess, and FDR had to clean up after that. But, you know, it was done before. It can be done. It's about the strength of the democracy. And this is something many societies face. I mean, chapter 1 of the book is about the U.S. history. Chapter 2 is about other countries. Other countries have this problem all the time. People get rich. They get powerful. We're really good at creating new ideas and new businesses that are not very regulated at the beginning. And, of course, it's when things aren't regulated you make the real money, right?
Yes, of course.
So we have that a lot. And we have a very open democratic system. You can come in. You can buy yourself a big seat at the table, right? So it's a problem that we face, a problem that other countries face. Other countries have struggled with this over the past 200 years since industrialization made the creation of these vast fortunes much quicker and much easier. We have also faced this problem. We have beaten back those corporate interests and the concentration of wealth and power. And, okay, we've got to do it again.
We got to do it again. So finally, as a conclusion here, you heard what I thought were the most important issues. And we both agree that we have this financial meltdown coming for us if we don't change course. So what do you think are the most important things to change so that we can avoid that iceberg?
Well, we have three things that we would like to insist on. The first and most important is reduce the size of the largest banks. Make them small enough to fail. If you don't like my $100 billion banks, let's go to 10 billion. Actually, the economies of scale in banking pretty much flatten out at about 10 to 20 billion, to be honest, right? Mm-hmm. So make them smaller, make them safe enough to fail. By all means, have a resolution authority so you can make sure that if anybody messes up down the road, you have that ability to come in. But just make them smaller, and we're just not going to lose much from a societal point of view. Secondly, a lot more capital in the system, which is equivalent to your leverage requirement. I had coffee with a senior European regulator last weekend before the volcano shut down Europe, and he said we need 20. This guy doing this with this job said we need 20 to 25% capital in the systems. I said, terrific, I agree. That's what the U.S. system had before 1913, before modern bailouts. It's just a bit of a struggle to get back there because politically we're going to go back to 10 to 12% capital. That's not enough, right?
Right.
So we're pushing very hard for more capital requirements, and all over-the-counter derivatives should stop. Over-the-counter derivatives lead to trouble. You need it all through regulated exchanges, and you need much more capital held against derivative positions. And basically, if you hold a bond through derivatives, an exposure to a security or a set of securities, that we need to be able to map that into what it would be, what that security would be without the derivatives. So you hold some derivatives that basically give you payoffs like a bond. You must hold the same capital against those positions as you would hold against the bond. Now that's pretty radical. I understand it would shut down a lot of derivatives trading. I understand a lot of smart people with PhDs would not have as much work to do, and they would just have to go out and create companies and applications for the new iPad.
Actually create something that would be, other than so-called financial innovation, that would be fantastic. So it appears that we obviously agree on a great majority of the things that we need to do. And by the way, you want to split up the big banks? I'd love that. Okay. So now, and we both agree, and almost everybody we've had on the show now on this issue agrees, there is an iceberg ahead, and we're on the ship. So in order to prove Simon right, you got to help move the ship. Okay. We've got to move the ship, otherwise we're going to hit it. So now 13 Bankers gives you a great explanation of that and some of the solutions. And is there a website that you can go to?
Absolutely. 13bankers.com is the book's website. And you can read the introduction for free.
All right. And I love the introduction, so that'll get you really interested. Simon Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really
Pleasure.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be right back on the Young Turks.